So, welcome back. So this is we'll try to put together some of the thoughts and conclusions of the conference we had. First of all, where should I start? So this was a conference on the question of what can an industrial production bring to the city. We had two days of discussions, and we're now trying to pull together some of the impressions and ideas what we came up with. I would first maybe just a short summary. So the idea was to look at how can industry once again be a driver for cultural change and the development of cities in the West, because as we know... Right. Hello? Okay. As we know, a big question was always whether industrial making and production can still be part of the Western city. And we are trying to think about what will be the impact of Renaissance of manufacturing, if that is even how we can call it. Whether production and industry can shape the cities of the future in the West. First of all, I would like just a brief description of all of the participants. Let's say each, if you can give us a summary of your presentation in, let's say, 2 brief sentences. And I will just start by chronological order, how everyone was presenting. So Anna was talking about, her title was Craftsman, Designer. From craftsman over designer to post-futurist innovators, brief thesis on the long history of making. It was about, as I understand, it was about the question of different times in the history of, let's say, past history and connection of these different times, and how these different people were doing these things. I don't know really well. Could you give a small example or? I think it is. You just need to.
We can just share this one.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I will try to try to formulate my own conclusion of not just my lecture, but a conclusion inspired by all the talks that happened yesterday and today. And it, of course, is also related to my own lecture from yesterday. So maybe, let's be a little bit provocative, I'm not sure if the real problem or the core of the problem lies in the fact that the production has been moved from the cities in the West. I see it merely as one of many symptoms of another core problem. And now I'm coming to what I tried to say yesterday, that the core of the problem probably lies in the fact that we have delegated the future, the social future, to the market. So it is basically the interests of capital and the successful processes of accumulation of capital which decide about our future and which decide where the production will be placed and what sort of the production. it is, in my opinion, rather a kind of romanticizing interpretation to think, yeah, we can somehow revive the production here if the capital doesn't find the interest in doing it. So if it is cheaper and more profitable to have it somewhere else, it will be somewhere else. And unfortunately, what I think the only possibility to develop a kind of new new production, new types of production in the cities in the West lies in the possibility that the capital finds the way to co-opt these new makers, movements, the idea of distributed, small-scale, open-source production. And I'm afraid that this is already going on because it is becoming also one of these activities that create the atmosphere of the creative city, which also has the entrepreneurial potential. And what we saw yesterday in one of the presentations, you know, this series of the cities which have already labeled themselves as fab cities or lab fab. Paris lab is a sign of this process. So from my point of view, what we should do first is to try somehow to revive within the emancipatory progressive political circles the discourse on the future. And then only if integrated into such a broader and more comprehensive discourse, these new cultures of making could gain some emancipatory potential. Thank you.
Does? Yeah. Yeah, it seems also you're talking about the questions about ethics and not so much. Okay, I heard a bit of that, like, you know, how capitalism is being used a lot, and then whether there is some kind of ethics involved to kind of circumvent that. But maybe we come back to this later. Okay, Milos, you were talking about the revitalization or necromancy, so you were looking at the post-industrial sites and their history and how their history is, let's say, used nowadays. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I was trying to think through the present projects of architects dealing with post-industrial sites, of trying to analyze them, trying to understand why they have a form that they have, how do they treat the post-industrial sites, and why do they do it in the specific way that they do, and what does that tell us, not so much about architecture, but what does the way architecture is used tell us about how we perceive our industrial past and future, if there is even such thing, like Anna said before. And this rise of nostalgia about the industrial production is an interesting sign, because although the production, like we continue to describe it, has moved elsewhere, it's still present in a way. It's negatively present in the Western world. So not only through the empty halls, empty production halls, empty factories, decaying, post-industrial ruins and so on, but also through the fact that the production is obviously somewhere. We get all of the mass-produced elements that enable us to have that 5 or 10% of, makers' movement production here. They are indivisible. So only if we have this production still going on in a huge tempo, with huge energies, with huge industrial capacities somewhere, we don't perceive it, but it's the shadow counterpart of this return to the to the makers movement. And this is the biggest, and I connect here, of course, to you, the biggest danger, I think, in this discourse of course, you can have the picturesque, shoemakers, cobblers, streets of happy people doing that and selling each other in a kind of a fair trade. But it's only possible within post-industrial context now and here, because the majority of materials and production comes here in a completely different way. It enables this picturesque production. So it's kind of a nostalgic covering one's own eyes to what the real problem is.
It's like having a blind spot somewhere about all the production that's actually sustaining our way of life. And
I think this is not only a spot, this is basically having a blind vision and only a small hole
the other
inside.
way around.
Yes.
It's like a visual spot and a blind hole in the air.
And I was basically, in my talk, I was trying to analyze this architectural discourse about it. It's interestingly uncritical in the way that it tries to preserve the post-industrial ruins as ruins. We seem to kind of find a strange, sublime enjoyment of inhabiting our glorious production past. It's interesting for me. I mean, just think architecture is often such a great, though unconscious, analyzer of what's happening in society. So to me, it's interesting to read it of what architects didn't want to say more than what they wanted to do with it.
Okay, thank you for now. So let's just do this round further, and then now we have Anya and Christina, and you were talking about making and the right to the city. You maybe were more not on the other side, but talking about the capacity of this making within the cities and how to bring some of that maybe back, or what is the alternative culture that is shaping around that. So could you give us a few thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think actually we were not on the other side.
Okay. Also worried.
I mean, for us, what we wanted to bring attention to is, on one hand, that, I mean, of course, we have to notice that this is a kind of process that is taking place. It's very difficult to ignore it, but I think we very much agreed with what Milos and Anna said, that it's a very hyper-optimistic and very, in a way, like ignoring way to focus on just purely the potential. I mean, obviously it does have a potential that we should also appreciate, but it's not something that has the capacity to offer us really an alternative future if we look solely at this idea of making, that we really miss the larger political project in this discourse that goes beyond the making. I don't know if you want to add something to this.
I think our key point is that somehow right now the maker movement is re-articulating a belief in the kind of liberating potential of technology, and this is a discourse that has already happened, like either with the arts and crafts movement, to which we also referred yesterday, but also in the 60s with the kind of like computers as this like individual tool that can free us up from the constraints that the society was posing to us until then. And somehow it kind of repeats the same mistakes of these things on focusing solely on the potential of the technology itself, and not to the kind of like broader vision that that these technologies can be used for. So it focuses on the instrument rather than the vision and the kind of like social contract.
So technology is salvation of humans, always to find all the solutions on our problems through the technology, or on the technology. Okay, thank you. And then we have Manuela. You were talking about rebalance. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Okay, I talk about rebalance between the hyperlocal and the development. So I think that the innovation is in the balance, the point of balance between this one. But So in that balance, we have the opportunity to define new forms of living and working. I think that the globalization has separated the citizens from local resources. So in this direction, we have the possibility to bring the production, the city. So I think that could be this the way. That's the production. Obviously, have to be not a mass production, but absolutely a local production, a quality production. So the people could return
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand. All right, thank you. Okay, it's interesting to hear so much skepticism, and I think that a lot of it's very warranted. And I think when you start to rethink the ideas, I'm sure that we can't imagine this kind of maybe specialized small boutique production to sustain our economies anymore. But let's say if you look a slightly bigger, right? We are in Wrocław, we are in a city where actually a lot of production is still happening and it's still in Europe. So this is producing some kind of culture and it's producing some kind of an environment that is based on that. I'm wondering whether it's also perhaps an image what an industry is that is problematic, that is always when, let's say, we talk about industry, we talk about history of it, or let's say when we talk about industrial production in Europe, we thought in historical senses. Let's say we always say, okay, either we connect it to mass production of the, let's say 40s, 50s up to 70s, or we connect it to even before when they started with first weaving and textile machines in the first industrial revolution. If anyone has any comments on that. Anna, yes.
So I think something we haven't spoken about much is this question of the ideological background of these glorious pictures of industrial production at the time when these pictures were produced. So the industrial production was and still is closely related to the kind of deeper ideological concept of economic growth. So what we have now since early 17th, when it was kind of proved that neither demographic nor economic growth are ecologically sustainable on the global scale. So it was a kind of a moment when the ideology of economic growth and its visual representation, these pictures of, factories and the steam and all that, lost the ground above its feet. And there is also a symbolical or ideological reason for moving factories to the places where we cannot see them. It is not only the reason that the labor is cheaper there, but there is also this symbolic dimension. We do not want to see the consequences of the economic paradigm that we are still following because we do not have formulated alternatives yet. So we enjoy looking the pictures of the past of our industry, but we don't want to see the pictures of their present. And so that's my answer.
Yeah,
and
so
this is also
maybe
a
connects
little
to
bit
Miloš,
about
no?
the architecture.
Exactly. So do you think, is there any alternative to that?
But just let me link a little bit to what you said. I often was thinking how possible is it to see a shabby chic store in Bangladesh, for instance, or this kind of decay aesthetics in one of the centers where the production is still happening? How commercially appealing can that be in a context where this is the mainstream, basically, not the kind of nostalgic past that you relate to? I have troubles picturing shabby chic store in Bangladesh. I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist. If it does, it's in a kind of a gated community, so it's alienated from that. I think that it's what you said. I just lost what I wanted to say before this picture, I have to admit it. What did you ask me?
Well, let's say if there is kind of an alternative to this, is there we are looking at what Anna was saying as a history, at these things as a historical artifacts, or always talking about the history of it, and it seems like a very maybe negative way of looking at it. Can we look at the industrial production or at the history of it much more in a positive way, not just as something that is decayed and something that has a historical value? No?
I think we need to look at it from the negative, from the critically negative way. I think that this is the way how modernity was basically functioning before the situation we are now, because there was always a reason to do things, better than they used to be done. So that, I mean, the paradigm of progress in a way was connected that people were never happy with the situation as it is. A little bit, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it's a little bit about the perception of the future, like you were describing it. And now, today, it's often said to us that, don't look just on the bad things, just also try to be productive. But true productivity comes from criticism. I think we should be more critical about production, obviously, because that is more creative in real sense, not in this rather perverse notion of creativity that basically just saying, yeah, you're doing this is great, you do that, this is great, this is completely different, but also great. Well, no, I think that we should be more critical if we want to be really productive, not just diversify things.
I mean, because why maybe I'm asking this is, for me, when you start asking why everything also went away from Europe, but again, I would say Wrocław is kind of a case in opposite, but it's also in the question of, how you value those things, whether it's the majority of things that are valued are, production of idea and concepts, which then get into patents and so on, and those things are then monetized on that level, right? And then the value of production as such, of making things just, making this pen, putting it together, it's really, really low, right? I mean, this then, I guess, also gets into the discussions about how you disperse the wealth and so on, but perhaps this is a longer discussion. But just if we stay with this, but do you see that maybe some of that could be, let's say that some of these practices, maybe also the Fab Lab and so on, to which, of course, we should all be critical, but at least they talk about the image of production or image of making things that is changing. And if we think about this as a long-term cultural process, it's, if you for 30 years or 40 years really thoroughly talk that, physical making is really not something that you should be doing, I'm wondering whether at least some of these practices are doing that. And in that sense, whether there is a kind of a parallel to, let's say, this maybe slightly critical way of what you were saying.
I think that the technology that's available can be used in brilliant ways. Technology that self-replicating machines, for instance, can be, so that a production unit does its own duplicate. I think this is potentially fantastic. But even with the best technology available within the current paradigm we're living in, it's not done according to the notions we profess to believe in. It's basically a self-regulating system, and it doesn't have much to do with what basically many people are talking or what our good intentions are. I mean, in our reality, basically, we mostly talk about good intentions, but the majority of the forces that are actually shaping our context are not affected by those, because we, like you said, basically we left the controls. Mm-hmm. We can now only talk about, and I don't want to continue this very depressing. Yeah.
I'm just trying to find if there is a rabbit hole through which we can pull this out.
I think it should be larger than a rabbit hole.
If we just perpetuate the negative part, it's really hard then to find something.
No, but I think
alternatives to it.
I think it's not about the alternative. I think it's precisely above affecting the mainstream, because alternatives is kind of incorporated. We have lots of little alternatives. You can pick your own. You can create your own, even better. It's not going to affect things. But the mainstream is the field of the real battle here. And how to do it, I have no idea. But it's a difficult question. It's a lot harder than it used to be, because alternatives are not really dangerous.
Okay. Maybe I connect this to Christina. You were saying that it shouldn't be about technology. So is it about shifting some ideas about how people perceive things?
Yes, and that I was actually wanting to give a little bit of a positive tone to this. Because
please help me out here. Yeah, I'm really grasping now for strands.
I mean, I do share Milos's pessimism, but I do think that indeed this whole turn towards the craft and appreciating the way things are made, it is a very positive a change in the way we relate to the stuff that we own and that we use. At the same time, it is a very niche market, and it is a very niche kind of it's a very luxurious thing to be able to choose what the things that you own. And I think this is this is exactly what you were saying, that it's not mainstream yet. But also thinking that actually, unfortunately, most change is initiated from the top. I think that might be a little bit of a positive message for you to, that if this kind of really becomes a very elitist thing, it will slowly trickle down to the mainstream.
Yeah, I guess this is one of the big questions, right? Whether, being in the West, where we are quite privileged to be able to have a lot of things, whether this can be then forward. That's a good question, and I don't think we'll find an answer today. Maybe Manuela, you have something to add? No? Okay. Let's see. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think also in relation to, I think everybody mentioned that also, I think the problem is somewhat that we stopped critically looking at how we define value. So what defines values? It's what Joanna mentioned, we just let this definition to what the market tells us, what is cheap and what is expensive, and what is valuable and what is not valuable. That's why this pen can be made, the way it can be made, and it can, be bought for the price that it is. And I think the really important thing that we can and should, try to pay more attention to is, do we really agree with these values? And in that sense, if, we look at this negative impact that is obviously hidden and, put in a sort of a black hole as if it didn't exist, it's really important to make it obvious that it is there. And, something that it made me think about it, because recently, through a series of the interviews we are doing right now, we interviewed a person from a Dutch organization who sued the government for not meeting the emission limits standards. And for me, this is, like a very important and valuable message that, like a citizen organized, an NGO basically, is looking at critically and publicly at what the government is doing and whether or not, this is the way we should be going forward.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like that there is, on one side the question of image, but I would again allude to, let's say, where we are sitting, right? We are sitting in a town where, production is alive and kicking, and it's reproducing, let's say, this city. Definitely a lot of the things that happen around here, the reason why the cultural events that are happening this year can happen is because of the strong economic base to it. So if we look at it from that direction, I would say that for me, let's say, craft and all these other movements that are, I see it more as a popularization of, let's say, industrial production, which I would say we lost this connection, right? But, but because, like Anna was saying, that it's out of sight, out of mind, maybe it's about trying to figure out whether, because these places of industrial production exist also around here, right? So if they would be more part of the daily consciousness of it, would that change anything? Or do you think that we are all too doomed to be able to change this economy, to start thinking in a different way? Any ideas on that? Go, Milos.
I think the question we should be asking is like, if we really are willing to live with less. I mean, if the question is like passing from a kind of like mass production that happens elsewhere to mass production that is like distributed evenly throughout like all our places. Yeah, but I'm not saying with living less. Let's say. I mean, it's still mass production. It's just more distributed, and I think it's the wrong question. Like. The question
what would be the question then?
Yeah, the question should be like, really, if we don't want to live with mass production, and not what kind of mass production we want to have.
Okay, I mean, this then goes on to the question of how to change the whole economic model and way of life, which is, I think it's like a Sisyphus work, or how do you say?
Yeah, but it's definitely the good question to pose, I think. And I know it's unsolvable, obviously, just within architecture. But, I mean, if we isolate architecture, that just means that we are creating a problem that doesn't exist. The real problem is connected to other fields. I think that the craft thing, I find it interesting that you said that this craftsman ideology is popularizing industrial production. I would say rather that craft movement and makers movement is connected to that the cultural value of the object that's not produced in a mass way gains value because so many of the things are out of sight or out of and so similar to each other. I mean, you have lots of stores where industrial products are later, a little bit changed, a little bit falsified, as if they were made by your grandmother, for instance. You have these stores that try to sell you object that is just made just for you, but in a mass way. And the craftsman's movement or the maker's movement is basically its value, its perceived value. I think it's directly connected to that. The value of a handmade, specific local object gains value precisely because we have so little of it left. I will try to address the thing that you now tried to ask 3 times and we successfully ignored about Wrocław being still a production center. And it's true. And I'm not I don't know a lot about the situation specifically in Wrocław, but I know that the discourse in Europe is usually, the industry is going to the east and so on, like we said. Only the high quality industrial production with a lot of added knowledge will be able to stay here. What's not said in these sentences is that it's implied as if this kind of knowledge and quality are not achievable in the East, for instance. But I would say, I mean, why not make a thought experiment of what the dynamics in the East and maybe 50 years from now in Africa will be. Obviously, they won't just stop their progress at a certain point and then just be happy to make things for less money than here. I mean, we just need to extrapolate our own examples from the 20th century and put it there. And they're going to be very similar, they're just going to be faster, and they will involve a lot more population. So we have a huge middle class going on the rise in China, and the dynamics will then maybe shift to Africa, and they will meet the problems we're having now, and we'll have some new problems. I mean, until this is a kind of a gigantic soup.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point for me as well, right? So let's say if you look this forward and everyone is trying to, let's say, Chinese, they work in these factories to provide better life for their kids, to educate them so they wouldn't have to work in the industrial places. So, but then if you start going on and on like this, where would you move all of the production? I think this is where for me comes this question of value of production, right?
I mean, if everything is then still controlled by the market, things can go on, but it would be a bit destructive for even a larger portion of population than now is, because according to the market, things will somehow solve themselves. But our societies and ecology will be the main elements affected here. So within the free market, it's pretty bleak. But I would say, I would really like to stress, I think this is the most optimistic way of looking at it, because you need to be critical about things to actually achieve an optimist level. Mm-hmm. So it appears bleak, but it's the least bleak. I think it's a lot bleaker to say, we'll just make shoes in this street and we'll just try to do it as long as possible.
It's about trying to see the bigger picture. I think that's really good. Yeah, Anna, you had something to add.
Yeah, just to reflect a little bit on this question that has been much in the air, the question regarding what is a better way of production, centralized versus decentralized, manual versus industrial, and so on. And I don't think that this is the right question, because one and the same type of production, let's say centralized mass production, can assume completely different shape depending on the economic model within which it exists. So we can have a picture of 19th century or 18th century factory in England with poor workers working the whole day, you know, these dark, almost dystopian pictures. And then we can also have a picture of a centralized mass factory within some different economic model, socially owned, where the workers have great, you know, rights, are educated about each part of the production process. The factory is according to the newest ecological standards, and so on and so on. So,
yeah. I have a feeling that everyone is saying that within the current economic model, it's really hard to change anything in terms of what is the, let's say, value of industrial production. How much should that change then, so that we can have something more viable? You know? Radically, yeah. I guess that's a good answer to it. Okay, let's see.
Maybe I'm the only one who hasn't said anything positive up to now, so I can
Go on.
And, any change obviously has two levels. It is a change of the model and the change of the subject who is going to achieve the change of the model. So in this sense, the ideas that were presented yesterday in Makers Movement and so on, particularly the idea of open source, I do think that they can have a positive effect on the formation of a different subjectivity. People who are more oriented towards sharing and so on. But it cannot be effective without, at the same time, thinking about how to change the model. So there is definitely this a positive aspect to the whole.
Yeah, okay, what I wanted to ask before now, I remembered again. We are now talking all the time about how capital is like free reigning, but we maybe forgot about all the institutions and let's say regulation that comes from the states and so on. Of course, in the last 30 maybe years, we follow quite, quite aggressive neoliberal direction where the state doesn't have any more that much of a control over, let's say, the ethics of economy, let's maybe call it like that. I'm wondering whether, how you see then the influence or of the state and all the policies that surround the economy, that maybe if we approach it from that direction, the solutions could be a bit more reachable than if we just see economy as completely neoliberal the way how it's now.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, this is also something that probably I don't really have enough knowledge about.
Yeah.
But like the one thing that I can imagine is that this is of course challenging. The state could have a bigger role in defining what the limit of the negative externalities is, and and just curb them. But on the other hand, it could also stimulate the positive effect that certain means of production can have on the environment, society, and so on. So this is not, a way of, again, like having a state centralized economy, but you have a state then that has a much stronger opinion in, like what is beneficial to the environment and society and all of the other levels that is trying to bring together, rather than just sit back and look at what's happening without actually having anything to say.
Okay. I think, would anyone like to add a few things? Anna, no? Yeah? Okay. Sorry? Yeah, maybe. Anyone from the audience? All right. Well, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. That's a wrap. Thank you.